It's an ethic that we, in our modern society, we are constantly trying to find out what is authentic for us.
When I hear the word nostalgia, I thought the personal
acknowledges admits that China so China's
Okay. One thing we discuss about is link to culture. Paul described in the page 390.
yes.
And we discussed about the relationship between Japan and China and the UK and Europe. The point was that both Japan and UK was the island country, and so isolated, geographically isolated from mainland. How to and the cultural relation between these countries, and I explained to Jay that the Japanese identities or Japanese culture is much influenced by Chinese culture, but in part because of the World War II, when Japan tried to colonize Chinese, and there's a bad relation between Japan and China. And so some of Japanese can't acknowledge that Japan influenced, culturally influenced by China, because that acknowledgement may destabilize Japanese identity, static identity. So some of Japanese people take attitude against China or anti-China. So what is interesting for me is that the anti attitude can be confined, makes how to say bad identity as a confinement into self-confinement. Yeah. Or anything else?
Just to take that conversation further, we talked about then the commonalities, similar situation in the relationship between the UK and Europe, in particular Germany, particularly given the English language and its origins, in the same way that China and Japan are linked through language. We sort of worked that through to talk about the sort of the functionality, if you like, of having a sort of a static image. So that on the one hand, you've got a stable and static image of cultural identity, and on the other hand, you've got a very rapidly changing, unstable one. And there's a certain functionality to having a static symbol, if you like, of a culture, because then it can be exchanged. It has stable value that can be exchanged. And that we talked about the anxiety if that culture or representation of a culture is seen to change too quickly, because it then becomes difficult to relativize in terms of exchange. We're not sure what we're exchanging with each other anymore. So that's kind of where we took that. And we used an example of the boiling point of water. Where 0 is where it freezes and it doesn't move and doesn't change, and 100 is where it boils off to a gas. If that boiling process, that change, the rate of change is too high, it's perceived as too hot, and people try and cool it down, and they want to try and freeze it. And that seems to be the goal, but don't want to take the metaphor too far.
Well, just going along on that point, I think what is taking place at the moment in Britain, Europe, and probably also in America, and how people have reacted, I think is partly due to this idea that sometimes the change has taken place for them too quickly, and they no longer recognize who they are, where they are. So if you are, for example, British, doesn't matter even if you're white or an ethnic minority who's been born in Britain, due to so many immigrants coming in a very short period of time, it makes you feel anxious because you no longer recognize the place you call home, or the people around you. And again, it's this point of if something happens too quickly.
I'm sorry, question. Are you referring to a certain time period? British American?
No, you at present day,
Okay.
but in any period of history, when there is an influx, there's always a reaction. So I think what we are seeing now isn't anything different. It's happened in the past before, but we tend to forget very quickly previous migrations. And I think that's humans are not very good at learning from the past.
I want to add some things to the discussion which we had. So because of the dramatic change, we cannot expect constant benefit from which we can usually get. But about science, because I'm studying about cognitive psychology, so I have to be using statistic calculation. Then, for example, yesterday I did the calculation by using computer, statistical calculation. Then I felt much safety because the relations between the symbols, which is very static. So I feel I can expect what happened, and the computer gave me the result, which is beneficial for me. Then, which was beneficial. So I felt safety because of the static relations.
I think if anybody wants to respond, they can.
Are you saying, excuse me, Shunsuke?
Yeah.
Are you saying that you yourself think that kind of static relationship is better?
Static relationship.
I mean, stable, fixed.
Beneficial because I can expect without anxiety. Without much consideration, I can expect the benefit.
So you're saying that kind of fixed, stable relationship is a kind of solution to the anxiety inclusion?
Yeah, kind of solution. One kind of solution for the anxiety. But the actual social situation cannot be such a thing. So I think another way to invent such a way of doing. But I think static situation is static thinking. Static relation. Static relation is one essential factor for solving the anxiety.
Thank you.
Just a question to you.
This fixed might be then a kind of escape of reality, because reality is not static.
Yeah. So about that. So about this point, I need some additional adjustment for my idea. For this idea. But I think even though you say that so the social is dramatic and changeable, but we as a human, we as animals have to think about the static relation, because so static relation should be considered. At least, I mean.
Can you give an example, just maybe, of what were you calculating? What kind of statistics?
for example, so I use the calculation of calculate to make the significant differences between two groups. Then but the computer shows that there's no difference between the two scores.
So what were the two groups?
Two groups, control group and experiment group. But I did another calculation. I did the scoring. I did change the scoring. Then the scoring at the first, the scoring the difference is very small. But at the second calculation, the scoring I made the difference is much bigger. So of course.
What were you studying, I guess?
Educational psychology. So I did the teaching methodology from the aspect of cognitive psychology, and so I did assess the effect of my experimental intervention in the research. Then anyway, I did some in my hypothesis I did some additional intervention to other calculation. Then computer following my hypothesis, it reflects the result because it depends on the static relation in the statistical theory.
Why do you ask? Is there a...
No, I'm just. I wonder if sometimes we can use statistics to find out information about the world, and sometimes this can be accurate. And I think it's very important because I think if we only did philosophy, we wouldn't know anything about the world, probably, or not very much. But so I think there's a value in using statistics to examine a situation or something very specific. But I don't think statistics always captures the complexity of the situation and what's going on. But
so that goes to Marinette's. Goes to Marinette's point about there being some circumstances in which stasis is desirable and possible, but other circumstances where stasis, well, for example, in the social world, where stasis is just never happens, and that everything is in constant change in relation to one another. So, and I think there's always a risk, if you like, that we can take the sort of the scientific way of looking at the world and superimpose it onto the social world, and imagine that these static categories can persist in our social relations. But just because it can exist in one domain does not mean that it can translate to another domain.
I think that how many of you participated in the symposium on Friday when Paul May talked about? Okay, I think that what Shunsuke just brought up, the issue is really the two cultures which Paul discussed, the relationship between science and humanities. And I think that some of you have just described, in certain circumstances you need scientific data. In other circumstances we need something which Paul is talking about. But I think that we should question about the way we sort of connect these two words, because Paul's talk on Friday was to sort of raise issues. The relationship between science and humanities are not necessarily complementary, or whatever you can choose depending on the situation. Would you like to say something?
No, that's
fine. I just wanted to follow up just on that, because I think, as I said, I think statistics or this kind of empirical research is important. I think sometimes in the humanities, I think we undermine the importance of it, and I think we often sort of look down on it, or we have the reputation. But I think my worry with over-relying on empirical research is that we can think of groups as fixed. And I think this relates back to the paper, this idea that we might study a group of people and come up with a sort of statistical calculation of something about that group of people, and then we can think of them as homogeneous, but actually there's something much more rich and something much more complex that I think requires us to look a bit deeper maybe. But I don't think we should also stand back and think that it's not important, because I think it is important as well. Yeah.
I agree with what Alison said, but even within the humanities, I think the kind of methodologies and the way we look at the reality don't have a grasp in its all complexity. I think we still need to look at this reality in a much more complex way that we are doing. Even we have reached a certain level of looking in different perspectives, we still need to. It's something that we still need to carry on doing in order to grasp even more different ways of to explain that reality. And I agree with you that we can work together with statistics and these other methods that they can together can combine a good quality to research.
What does your table discuss in relation to paper? What does your table discuss in relation to
Just talking about Heidegger.
Oh yeah, or even before. So we begin. Okay. So our discussion began with our own experience. Like we began with the question of have we ever experienced the anxiety of exclusion or inclusion, which Paul has just presented. And then, well, yeah, we have talked about the kind of pressure of to be conformed with the standard society or culture in Japan. And then, well, Ryota said that, well, sometimes we or he can, well, decide not to be. Well, I'm sorry. Before that, Marionette just asked Marietta. Sorry, Marietta. Sorry, I'm bad with names. People, sorry. Well, so Marietta just said, posed a question: how do we Japanese feeling uncomfortable with the pressure of conformity react to that situation when it happens? And then Ryota said that yeah, he has an experience of deciding not to be in the group. So we just talked about the choice we make in the situation of feeling anxiety of exclusion, inclusion. And then what else? And then also we talked about the differences, the definitions of inauthenticity, which you were raising, Paul was raising in the presentation, and authenticity in the paper. Well, yeah, especially Kensuke clarified the point. And then what else?
And also, there is also a point in which we are talking about inclusion and exclusion, and for some groups maybe we would prefer not to be part. Or, for example, if you were in a group and they are members of, for example, extreme, at least from my point of view, Ku Klux Klan, something like that, I would prefer not to be part of that group. So I would detach myself. So there is something about inclusion and exclusion. If you're excluding yourself from things where you don't belong to.
Okay. Nami posed the question of the authenticity. I think the authenticity in your presentation and the authenticity in this paper is a little different. And Nami questioned about Heidegger's authenticity. Heidegger thinks of the anxiety toward death is a very authentic form of anxiety. But I think that formulation is too abstract and too simplified to the real anxiety we feel. In this sense, as Marinetti said, philosophy or humanities also has a methodology, and abstraction to the reality, as the science have, and to the anxiety. And I want to connect this point to the subjective anxiety and objective anxiety, and in the I think empirical information is too reductive, but it can reduce the subjective anxiety. For example, in the Fukushima, the power plant is broken, and there is a rumor to increase the people's anxieties, and many scientists think the scientific knowledge or empirical information can reduce the anxiety, such anxiety, but such anxiety is different from such anxiety is very real to the people who live in the Fukushima, but that is maybe that is different from what you say in this presentation. So I think there is a difference between the usage of anxiety. Yeah.
Should we perhaps go to the last group?
Well, at the start, we also talked about the difference between when Paul was using the term authenticity, and I think maybe I'm completely wrong, but how Charles Taylor, who Paul refers to, uses this term of authenticity. And in one of his books, Charles Taylor talks about authenticity as a sort of a driving force of modern identity, and there is often a sort of pressure to be authentic and to be original, and to be non-conformists. So we sort of use the example of hipsters, which, do you remember the Japanese word for the hipster? You also have it in Japan. What's the word? Do you want to say it? Actually, this doesn't make anything matter. So. Anyway, so it's not that important, but so hipsters is this kind of sort of culture in Western Europe, and there's this sort of very inauthentic practice of purposely trying to be non-conformist. So constantly, trying to only drink beer that isn't sort of mass-produced, or only listen to music that nobody else knows about, so there's a real pressure to be non-conformist, and that's a very sort of inauthentic way of doing it. So we kind of talked a bit about that, and Adrian wants to.
I mean, one of the other things that came up that we talked about was the idea of nostalgia, and we talked about that in relation to Brexit, and the sort of and in terms of Paul's paper as well, and what Paul is saying about the sort of the instability that can be there at the sort of heart of rather than as sort of something essential and authentic at the heart of cultural identity, that it's much more fluid, which I think is the point that Paul is trying to make. And there's a kind of heterogeneity rather than a homogeneity within cultural identity. But there was perhaps not an explicit appeal to a British cultural identity. Perhaps it was more implicit, because one of the problems is once you start sort of questioning what exactly British cultural identity actually is, you come to realise just how influenced it is by so many things that sort of lie outside it, and so perhaps that's why it's sort of there was an implicit aspect to that rather than an explicit that, because it's very hard to make explicit exactly what that cultural identity is, as distinct from the influences that are working on it. And we also talked at the end, and perhaps you'd like to say more about this, about nostalgia for a cultural identity, and whether in Japan, whether there are generational differences in terms of a nostalgia for a past, in particular, for example, in relation to, let's say, the place of religion in that there are differences there between the generations. But perhaps you'd like to say more about that. So I'm giving you the microphone.
Sorry.
Well, just that thing I said at the end about nostalgia, you were talking about the younger generation's attitude to religion in Japan and its place.
In my opinion, not to believe a specific religion is the religion for almost Japanese, but we don't have we don't have a foundation, so it's difficult to say what is authentic. Yeah. Yeah.
Maybe what you said about how you understood nostalgia and what it meant when you first saw the word nostalgia. What did you think?
Okay. Oh, sorry. When I read this paper first time, I thought the word nostalgia means I come up with the homeland when I was a baby, country, a farm and an old house, a Japanese old house, and all the Japanese food, washoku, and so on. But this paper says, I think, our cultural identity about. So it's difference for me to Japanese, now Japanese young generation and old generation, former thinks identity. Former don't think identity so seriously. I think that older generation, as some of older generation, think Japanese identity.
So you were saying that you thought the younger generation was more open to Western.
Yeah.
But that this wasn't a problem.
Yes.
I have just a question for you. You said about, in terms of religion, that you don't have a foundation. What exactly do you mean by that?
Foundation?
Yeah.
It's very difficult. For me, I don't believe a specific religion, so specific foundation, but I really believe something. So yeah, I can't name this. What? Some yes. Do you understand? Yeah.
Yeah.
Just about what you just said. You believe in something, but you said no. You talked about that not being a foundation. But if you believe in something, surely there is. You have a foundation.
Yeah.
or do you think you need a particular religion to have foundation?
I don't think I don't think I need the foundation. I'll say I don't need the foundation, but I have something to believe. Yeah.
Okay. okay.
Yeah, it's very difficult to say.
No, that's fine.
My comment is to Kazunao, and my question is your point is that we will something what we don't know, but your point is maybe that we have the religion, but such religion cannot be explicit. Many people said Japanese religion is Buddhism, but China also believe in Buddhism. But the difference between China's Buddhism and Japanese Buddhism is difficult to say, and that is the implicit difference, maybe.
Yeah.
Maybe so. I think your point is that Japanese religion is may have something authentic, but it is very difficult to make explicit.
Yeah.
So,
I think in the aspect of the religion, I think we can say that the way of Japanese religion is more is not so much distinctive from the secular way life. So the notion of the religion is quite different, or is quite different in the Japanese culture. So if we say something about religion, we are also talking about the way of life. So that's not very quite far from the everyday life or the religion. Yeah. So that's the point I think you have.
So the Japanese religion is difficult to talk as a religion. Yeah.
There's no such a special way to express or to be distinctive in a such so-called religious group. So it's quite different for Japanese to tell what is in the Western way of religion.
Yeah. So it's not institutionalized, maybe?
No, maybe.
Maybe it's something related to the etymology of the word in terms of religion, religare, reconnection. Reconnection to depends on faith-based days. Yeah, could be a metaphysical God, it could be a nature, it could be different ways of you to reconnect with what's meaningful for you.
Okay, so shall we stop here now?